I also want to say thank you to the 4 organizing bodies who have put this amazing conversation together, to BCCIC, who has provided a lot of the coordination and the tech pieces, to Amnesty International. We have tech people behind the scenes from Amnesty who are working with us to make this happen, to UBC Oris and all the work that they have done to pull all the pieces together, and also to the Global Lounge at UBC who are working so diligently to engage students across the campus in this conversation. And now I have the distinct pleasure to introduce you to my friend, my colleague, our executive director at BCCIC, Ankat Bajar. Over to you, Ankat.
I love this. I love the fact that Colleen presents this event in the same way that I would. There's a kind of synergy. However, we also know that among us, there's a lot of diversity, hopefully. And I'd like to, first of all, as a representative of the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, but also as a woman, activist, seeker of peace, total activist, I'm really pleased to be able to present or introduce in the name of Amnesty International, UBC Oris, and the UBC Global Lounge, together with us, BCCIC, this event that we've, it's not just the work, that we've really aspired to hear the voices of about different perspectives on women's leadership in peace processes. Before introducing further, I would like to do my own land acknowledgement, which has to do with the fact that for me, it's not just, and I would hope that others of you may have lived in different countries, it's not only the country we live in and the lands that we occupy now, but the lands and the histories that we've occupied wherever we've lived. So I recognize the 14 populations of Liberia, and having worked and lived and played with 4 of them. Having lived in Bolivia, there's 34 nations, but of those nations, I have actually lived and worked and played with only about 6 of their livelihoods, territories, spirituality, and everything. Right now, I am standing and residing on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I always see the land and the peoples around me, but I look for it in history as well. I look for it in my friends, their sons, their grandparents, and grandmothers. And I would ask you to maybe reflect for 30 seconds on not just territory as if it was our geography, but anyone around you, descended of Indigenous peoples whose lands were occupied, continue to be occupied, what you know of them, their situation, their condition, the inequalities, or perhaps if it's no longer a matter of inequality for an individual, the struggle they've gone through. So in my mind, I'm honoring very closely a friend of mine every time I think of territorial acknowledgement. I think of her, her children, the fact that she's raising her grandchildren and great-grandchild as well. So let's make it from the heart. I really acknowledge from the heart my situation and position as a settler on lands that have been, and territories that have been occupied. I didn't give you those 30 seconds, so I will be quiet for 30 seconds and let you reflect. Looking up to the sky, not down to the earth. It depends. It is an honor. Again, I mean, the event is called Women's Leadership in the Pursuit of Peace and Security, and we have 4 fantastic speakers with us, panelists, and we have close to 100 participants who are either interested, invested, working, activist on that topic as well. But we also have the honor of having with us Anita Vandenbelt, who is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development. She will be introducing this event, leading off our kickoff on International Development Week. And when I have to mention the event again in conjunction with your name, Anita, it's because I was so pleased to see some of the different committees that you're on, and some of, well, one award that you had. I know we don't live for awards, but when you get awarded something, it's worth saying, right? So Anita is an MP, parliamentary secretary, all the formal part of life, but is also a long-standing activist for peace and for women's rights, is on the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, I believe, also on the Subcommittee on International Human Rights, from the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs and International Development. And the prize that I managed to find that you did receive, which again, it's not about the prize, but what you did before getting the prize, was a Canadian Peacekeeping Service Medal. So it's very appropriate, and we are so grateful that Global Affairs Canada has supported us in obtaining your participation at this event. I would now turn the words and the speech over to you.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and also for that introduction. I always start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, but your introduction makes me think even more about all of the other places that I've been and thinking about acknowledging that as well. So I appreciate that very much. Every time we do one of these, we learn new things. And I'm very much looking forward to learning a lot of new things in the next couple of hours from all of you. I had a chance to be introduced to some of the panelists, and I think that we're going to have a lot to share. I'd like to thank BC CIC, of course, for providing this opportunity, and also the incredible organizations and the individuals and the panel of experts that are here today. You know that it's International Development Week, which of course celebrates the people of Canada working in support of international development from coast to coast to coast. And it shines a spotlight on your important work and contributions around the world. During this week, we encourage people from all walks of life to share their stories and to encourage, inspire, and invite all of us, but particularly young people, to get involved in the international effort to help, to innovate, and build better lives around the world. I'd like to thank you and the partner organizations that work tirelessly on making these goals a reality. This year's International Development Week has 5 themes, as most of you probably know: gender equality, health, economic resilience, education, and climate action. And all of these align with the Sustainable Development Goals. They call on us to reflect on how we build resilient, inclusive, and sustainable societies and economies that benefit all people while also protecting our planet. While these goals are very ambitious, they do reflect the scope of these global challenges and give us real targets to strive toward. Canada recognizes that gender equality is a foundation for peace and implementation for peace, and implements the Women, Peace and Security agenda through the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. We are currently, as I think many of you are aware, developing our 3rd National Action Plan with the ambition to strengthen our whole of government approach and the plan's domestic reach. And I think this discussion today is going to be a very important part of that. And I will definitely be taking, I know it's close, but I will be taking this back to the minister and to the department. I know the minister very much wanted to be here today, but couldn't be. In partnership with other countries and with civil society, Canada works to advance the women, peace, and security in regional and international fora, to break down barriers to women's full and meaningful participation, and to stand firmly against attempts to roll back the gains that we have already made. Canada's launched a new Women, Peace and Security Awards program to recognize, I know that you said awards are not the reason that we do this, but still that recognition is very important. So we will recognize outstanding contributions by civil society. And we have provided $150 million to Women's Voice and Leadership Program. And that, along with the $300 million partnership with the Equality Fund, aims to address the funding gap faced by women's organizations and movements in order to advance gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in developing countries, including fragile and conflict-affected settings. This puts Canada among the world's top donors to global women's organizations and movements in developing countries. We undertake these efforts because we know that sustainable peace requires women's meaningful and equal participation in peace and security efforts. And we know also that it isn't just about making women beneficiaries. It's about full inclusion and participation. It's about making sure that women are part of the planning, part of the design, part of the implementation of these programs, And then we will make sure that these programs are able to benefit women, men, girls, boys, gender diverse persons. The programs will be able to benefit all. And we also know, and I've seen on the ground firsthand in places like Kosovo and Bosnia and DRC, how vitally important it is that women's voices are at the table in order to have sustaining peace. So I'm very much looking forward, and I will turn the floor back over, but I will be here throughout, and I'll certainly be listening with great interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I really appreciated the depth and breadth and the attention to the action plan and the to be developed action plan. That's good to know that what gets discussed today might feed into that conversation. Thank you. Just before we get to actually get into the conversation, I want to let all of you who are participating, including our guests, to know that we're going to pose a couple of questions over the course of this conversation to provide you some opportunities to reflect and think about women and leadership. And I think we're going to get one posted right up on your screen right now. And I'd like to invite you to think about a woman. She may be famous, or they may be famous, or perhaps not, who's a leader. And I'd like you to think about the qualities that you most admire in that person. And I'd like you to think about the characteristics that make them a leader. And just grab a piece of paper or a notepad and a pen. And as we move through this conversation, jot down, what are those qualities? What are those characteristics that make that person a leader? And we'll ask you to share those with us as we move towards the end of the conversation. So thank you for jumping in and participating with that. And now I have the pleasure, and I do mean pleasure. I've spent some time over the last couple of weeks getting to know the four women I'm about to introduce you to in an electronic way, and I'm delighted to get to know them a lot more in a person-to-person way. So let me introduce you first to Jen Freeman. Jen is currently the CEO of Peace Geeks, and Peace Geeks, you definitely should check out their website, uses digital tools to empower the pursuit of peace, an important and key function in where we are in this day and age. Jen brings 18 years of experience, including in conflict zones and resettlement. And I'm interested to know that Jen shares her knowledge in an academic setting, both in the UK and in the United States. So welcome, Jen. Now let me introduce you to Nazik Caballo. Nazik has 15 years of experience documenting and advocating for women in the Sudan. She is a women human rights defender and has done some writing both for Amnesty International and for democracy, open democracy. I also want to introduce you to Elaine Woodsworth. Elaine works to create solutions that are intersectional, feminist, green, and just as we focus on economic recovery. And Elaine has been a counselor on Vancouver City Council, and she also works to engage women and girls in civic life, an important part of that engagement process. And I also like to introduce you to Charlotte. Charlotte Haynes is a senior program advisor with Justice Education Society, and she wins the prize as being the one the farthest away from where BCCIC is located in Vancouver, because she is currently coming to us from Guatemala. She's been living in Guatemala for the last 7 years, where she's working on doctoral research to focus on teaching difficult histories. So we're thrilled to have all of you join us around this table and this conversation. And as audience members, I should let you know that you are looking at a circular table with the 5 of us sitting around that table. And I've invited the guests at the table, as I ask a question, if they want to ask another question of each other, to jump in and do that so that we can create a really authentic conversation. It's more important to get solid and interesting conversation than to get through a checklist of conversations. But first, before we actually jump into the meat of this, we need to get to know you a little bit more. So I'd like to ask each of you, what's your experience as a woman in leading peace building? And Nazik, can I start with you?
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very glad to be joining this extraordinary panel today and discussing this very important topic about women leadership in peace and security. For me personally, I see that my work in advocacy and documentation of human rights violations in conflict areas as an important role for me to empower the messages of the need for accountability, sustainable peace that would never be possible without justice. And I think the part of my work that's focusing on justice and accountability for the crimes in conflict areas, against women, especially sexual and gender-based crimes in conflict context, is a vital and essential part of creation of the knowledge first, and creation of the information that is needed for any successful peace process. For example, in Sudan, we have 50 years history of civil war and ethnical tensions and racism and all kind of conflicts you can imagine, and reasons of conflicts, religious, racial, all of them. We have them all. So for all of the parties involved in these kind of conflicts, we need always to in many times we need them even to understand the kind of violence that they are causing because of these conflicts. And this is what I think my work comes in to make all parties recognize the effects on the communities, the effects on especially on women, to be part of the processes of peace and community impact. I have been part of documentation, advocacy, and reporting against the crimes committed in my country last 30 years. Have worked with Amnesty International, with the Human Rights Watch, and I am a member in the International Coalition for the ICC. During all of these roles, this is what I'm trying to do, is to make peace more sustainable through justice.
Thank you so much, Nazik, for those words. Jen, over to you.
Thank you. It's hard to follow that. But I mean, I think that that's relevant to what I wanted to share, and that's that I think I've struggled with identifying myself as a woman leading peace building. I had the privilege of learning peace building from women peacemakers like Luz Mendes and Alison Deritu and Lema Bowie, and working with them for many years. So thinking about my positionality and the role I had, either working with women peace leaders who are from living and working in conflict zones around the world, versus my role in academia or as an educator, or with transnational solidarity movements like ICANN and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or Women's Alliance for Security Leadership. Those different roles are very different than the work of women building peace, women peace leaders in places like obviously Kashmir, or Sudan, or Colombia, or Mindanao, or Afghanistan. But through that work, I learned from women leaders too, the value of considering the financial and military influences of the countries that I hold citizenship, which are US, Canada, and the UK, that I had a vital role to play, both as a citizen, as an advocate, as a voter, engaging in policy advocacy, to my governments to change their influence on international development and the conflicts that peace leaders were often fighting at the front lines of. And then also how to be a peace builder at home, how to be a better peace builder at home. During my years living in the US, I had the opportunity to not only train and educate young peace builders coming up through undergraduate and graduate programs, but as a mother, I had the chance to take my children to protests on human rights issues for human rights violations that were going on in the US, which was the country they were born into. And then I've had the joy of finally returning home to Canada after living overseas for 18 years and getting to reimagine and re-engage with what peace building looks like here in Canada, and the opportunity to work very hard to relearn for myself what right relations are like, working with the Indigenous populations of this land. And then also in my work with Peace Geeks to work not only internationally and in Jordan and with UNHCR and the International Criminal Court, but also how we work here in Canada to try and build a more peaceful Canada through the work we do domestically, which is welcoming immigrants and refugees and newcomers to Canada and helping work across the country to build more welcoming, inclusive societies through using digital tools in those efforts. So it's an ongoing work in process, I feel like, but constantly thinking about what is my positionality in terms of working as a woman supporting peace efforts around the world.
Thanks, Jenna. I want to reflect on your comment around not sure how you position yourself as a leader. And as a student of leadership, I would say that leadership is in all of us. And some of us have titles and lots of people who work with us and work for us. And sometimes it's what we do around the kitchen table and over the fence and at the grocery store. So thank you for raising that up. And with that, Ellen, may I pass the conversation to you?
Thank you very much. I love that last little comment about the many, many ways. I think especially now because of COVID-19 and in Canada and our fears because the anti-vax demonstration, we're all conscious of the need for peace and ways of finding peace and building peace movements. I was fortunate to grow up in a family that was very active in fighting for nuclear disarmament. It was the 60s. I met Satsuko Thurlow and in grade 8 interviewed her because she was a friend of my father's. My father grew up in Japan. And my mother's best friend was Kay McPherson, who set up Voice of Women for Peace. So I got together with some high school students and set up the Canadian High School Students for Nuclear Disarmament. And then as I got more active in other social movements, in 1970, I was part of the committee that organized the Indo-Chinese Women's Conference, which was bringing Indo-Chinese women to Canada so they could meet with their American counterparts and figure out how to work together for peace and then withdrawal of the Americans from Indochina. When I was elected the first lesbian councillor in Canada, first in Vancouver, I was able to help set up the Peace and Justice Committee, and I worked on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls issues in the downtown East Side. And I work with the Save Article 9 Coalition. Article 9 is an article saying that the Japanese government will never go to war, and Costa Rica, I believe, is the only other country that has adopted Article 9. And then I was co-founder of the World Peace Forum and Women's Peace Conference in Vancouver, which brought together over 35,000 people from around the world and had a special women's section called Challenging Militarism, Women, War, and Social Justice. I was introduced to Women's International League and Freedom again at that time and invited to be the delegate to the Bolivia conference where I met Anne-Catherine. and had a wonderful time being introduced to First Nations governance in Bolivia and getting to visit some of the projects that Anne-Catherine was working on. In 2019, as co-chair of Women Transforming Cities International, I was invited to be the keynote speaker at the National Democratic Institute Herstory Conference in Kurdistan, and worked helping the women in 5 of the provinces in Kurdistan to build their women's organizations. And finally, I was invited to the World Urban Forum in Abu Dhabi to speak about two-spirit, lesbian, gay, transgendered, bisexual, queer, indigenous, and other gender-different people in a country that makes it punishable by death to be queer. So I've had an opportunity to meet with many women activists and to understand the importance in our building our peace movements to really understand the different ways in which peace is important, and spending on peace and not on war can make this world work for everyone, but we have to see everyone. That's why I use an intersectional lens on all of my work.
Thanks, Ellen. I really appreciate how your summary of those beginnings around your kitchen table have created so many connections and interconnections. And Jen, you talked about those as well as you meet people and the circles combine and connect with each other. And just to finish moving around the table to get to know all the guests at the table, Charlotte, what can you tell us about your experience leading in peace building?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. What's really been interesting as I'm listening to the other folks here around our virtual table is that there's a lot of different approaches that folks are bringing in. So I think that'll be generative for conversation. I currently am working for Justice Education Society, which has its main headquarters in Vancouver, but I am living in Guatemala, as Colleen mentioned, where we recently wrapped up a 4-year project with GAC about building a technological platform to support victim services. Jess has over 30 years of working with the justice sector, so very much has an institutional approach of capacity building of institutions in the justice sector, working with prosecutors, judges, the police, to build capacity and try to find sustainable peace building and approaches to justice at an institutional level. So most recently, the project that we wrapped up in December was building a platform for those that provide services to victims and survivors of gender-based violence and other crimes in Guatemala. So I will be speaking mostly from my experience of living in Guatemala and working in Guatemala the past few years. And I want to recognize my positionality as an outsider that has been working in Guatemala, that has been doing my doctoral research in Guatemala. More than anything, my background is in the education part of the Justice Education Society. And as was mentioned, sort of thinking about looking at peace building through education and what does it look like to look at histories of colonialism, of violence, of genocide, as you're trying to look at it and solve issues of security and violence in the present. So it is worth noting that background for me in terms of history education and as peace and human rights educator, that it's difficult to confront social inequalities in the present and the high rates of homicide in Guatemala and impunity and corruption without tracing that back to colonial legacies. Or more recently, the peace accords in Guatemala were signed about 25 years ago, but looking at the legacies of violence and state-sanctioned violence and state-sanctioned massacre, and also the histories of forgetting, of trying to sort of turn the page and what's the impact of that. So the work, with Amnesty International that I'm hearing in Sudan that I hope we hear more about, that piece about documentation and truth-telling is really critical. And so that will be interesting to talk more about. So I live a little bit between those two worlds, as it sounds like Jen does as well, between academia and practice, where intersectional, thank you, Ellen, sort of that intersectional gender lens is really critical to everything, sort of both that I'm trying to do sort of as a writer and as a project director. And I think I just want to also begin with thinking about gender as this critical lens for unpacking the difficulties and challenges of peace building, both in terms of negative peace, that taking away of the active violence and active conflict, and the positive piece of all the other things that you need for peace building, but an intersectional approach that really exposes those myriad vulnerabilities related to colonialism, racial discrimination, institutionalized violence, right? And to also think about this, unpack a little bit, this notion of what is this women, that it's a really not a homogenous concept, that it is something that is constructed. And so how can we have this gender-based critical lens for looking at peace building, particularly if we're talking about women, but broadly within other conceptions and all the other vulnerabilities and precarities that women broadly defined have to walk through on a daily basis as they're trying to find security and justice in their everyday lives. So I look forward to the discussion and how we all tie it together.
Thank you so much to all of you. My own experience in working in global engagement is not in peace and security. And so I have to say that my head is spinning with a lot of language and a lot of vocabulary. So I'm going to encourage everybody who's watching this conversation and as part of the circle is to just take some notes as you're hearing language that you're not familiar with, so that you can go and do some Googling, because there's lots of information out there. And I encourage you to do that. I also am an educator, so that comes from my lens of coping with the amount of language that is so embedded in this work. And for all the people who are sitting behind me, I'm going to just reorder some of the questions because I want to tap into what all of you have just said. And I want to focus on the question, this question about all the organizations that you work with are deeply engaged in bringing transformative justice to the communities you serve. A key part of the work that you're talking about uses a gendered and intersectional lens. How are you approaching this in the work that you do? And Charlotte, why don't I start with you, if you don't mind?
Sure, thank you. I'd like to talk a bit more about what the most recent approach and the project that Jess recently implemented around creating a technological platform. And I think it's particularly relevant within the current context. We're having a virtual conversation and there are more and more of those. There's been a push online. And so thinking about technology within peace building, within the search for justice and access, and also the limits of that, and I think is really useful for any conversation that we're having about peace building now. So just to give a bit of context, we created a platform with the prosecutor's office that was a case management and referral platform for those the psychologists and social workers that attend to victims of violence that come to report a crime. Right. And so there are a couple pieces of the way that sort of that intersectional gender lens came into our work. And part of that is trying to put that into practice. So it is part of these practitioners, these victim service providers, everyday practice. So that goes to, from the very basic of you're sitting down and interviewing a victim, what are the questions you're asking, right? Is your sexual orientation a box that you check off that you're one of the LGBTQ folks, or is that a drop-down list? Are you asking about sex or gender? Are you asking about your gender identity? Does the victim service provider have to know the difference where they put cisgender and transgender? So some of the very basic changes are just changing that input information, which was set up in the 90s and didn't really reflect both in terms of gender, but also pueblo and ethnic identity. It wasn't capturing both linguistic communities and ethnic identities. So putting that into practice, so it's part of people's everyday work and as part of the learning they have to do to do their job, was part of the approach. Along with online courses to sort of work through, what do we mean by cisgender? What do we mean by transgender? How do we talk about and attend to the needs of Indigenous women? How do we attend to folks with disabilities? And so having that explicit courses right, that are supporting victim service providers and taking that intersectional approach and how they're approaching victim care, while at the same time, it being part of their everyday practice. It's not just a course they took and great, we'll leave that over there to the side. How do you bring it into your everyday practice? So it's something I have to engage with on an everyday basis. At the same time, also the platform provides disaggregated data. So it's also in how you see the data. Your platform, your dashboards are set up so you are seeing your data broken down by ethnic identity, by gender, by disability, and all these other, by age, and many, many other. So it's part of what you're seeing. It becomes part of your everyday work. So having that sort of capacity building alongside with changing sort of what people interact with. So it's part of the system and part of how they walk through their lives and the system that they have to see every day was kind of the approach that we had in this project. And if I may direct people to our website as well, that was created, that now lives at the prosecutor's office. It's called ayuda.gt. You'll see that was also in representation and making sure that the representation of the images of the information that was being given to survivors of violence, and victims of violence, which is what the website does, is try to help people figure out what to do when they need help, if they're victims of a crime, that there are images and illustrations that look like you. And that's very important. And took a lot of time taking to the details of what it looks like to walk through Guatemala and live in Guatemala. So I'll close there. Thank you.
Wow. One of the things that I used to do when I worked with students was talk about, you bring something into the norm so much that it's like fog in the trees, or so that it's just there, it's part of. And I think that your explanation and the conversation, Charlotte, about what you've been doing talks about it just becomes infused into how you see the world. So thank you so much for that. Nazik, how are you infusing intersectionality and gender into the work that you've been doing in Sudan?
In Sudan, actually, recently in October 2020, we had a new peace agreement, which included most of the conflict areas in Sudan. This peace agreement was very important in the course of the process of the democratic transition in the country, because in 2018, in December, Sudanese people went on the streets and had a very big protest that led to what we call it a revolution now. And we succeeded in ending one of the most violent regimes in Africa and in the Middle East, the fundamental Islamic and militarized regime of Omar al-Bashir, which committed the first genocide in the 21st century, and therefore between 2003 and 2007. So Sudanese people were very proud of ending that regime in April 2019. Women played a major role in organizing, mobilizing, and some researchers found that more than 70% of women of protesters on the streets were women, actually, and especially young women. So to end the conflicts that were taking place in the country during the 30 years of the military regime, a process of negotiations for peace is started in 2020 and ended a year later with the peace agreement that should have ended the conflicts in most of Sudan today. Actually, it was very important for me and for our group to highlight the women participation in the peace process itself, and how the peace agreement itself also was committed to gender equality, to the 1325 UN resolution for women peace, for women participation in the peace and security processes, and all of that. So we're very keen to actually at one hand to criticize what we have seen that was not enough, especially in comparison with the role of women that are playing already on the ground, and also to commend the kind of progress that's have been done during the process. We published a small brief analyzing the peace agreements that have been done in 2020. We found lots of progress related to women participation, that the agreement granted 40% for women participation at all political levels, which is something that's very important for us. It's also recognized the importance of the 1325 resolution and committed to implement it through the agreement. Also, what was very important, I think, at that process was the actual presence of some women in the moments of signing the agreements, which was something that was very significant, that some of the armed leaders chose to back down and give this space to a couple of women. In this process, the UN Women has participated positively in creating a track 2 process, which is in this in the terms of women participation in peace and security. A track 2 participation in peace negotiations means that it's a new kind of a new practice where women participate in processes of negotiations, but not inside the negotiations rooms or within the tables, but mostly working around the process of the negotiations by facilitating engagements of community leaders and other women and the NGOs and so on. So that was something that was very important and helped in engaging more women in the process. And we thought that this was something that's worth highlighting and also commending for the process at that moment. Actually, we, and unfortunately, in October 25th, just 3 months from now, Sudan witnessed a new military coup, and we lost most of the progress that we have done in the last 3 years since 2019. But I'm very proud that my fellow women on the streets on Sudan, until the moment I'm speaking right now, women are on the front line protesting, leading a process of change that should include the whole country, not just areas where there is conflict. Because in the end of the day, we as women, our fight against any militarized regime is a very fundamental, cause, because as we know, as women activists, peace activists, a militarized state, that's mean no peace and no security at all when you have a militarized leadership. And that's why Sudanese people have been, and especially women, on the front line for the last 3 months with 78 people killed, 2 of them were women, and dozens of women who have been raped and injured. And I think this is a kind of an understanding for the need for peace. Actually, our revolution slogan have 3 words, and peace comes first: peace, justice, and freedom. So this is a kind of the actual deep understanding for the intersection of gender, peace, security, and democracy as well.
Thank you so much, Nazik. And Jen, I just want to go to you and pick up on that thread of conversation from Nazik. And I want to start with some references to something that I pulled off the UN website, where they talk about we need more women involved to build sustainable peace. And I'm going to quote from the website where they say, the evidence is clear. Wherever women take part in a peace process, peace lasts longer. In fact, the website says a peace agreement which includes women, where, as you said, Nazik, they give space for women. There is a 35% more likelihood that that peace will last at least 15 years. Those are startling numbers. And so building on what Nazika said, Jen, I'm wondering, why is that? Why is it that when you engage women, I mean, it seems like such a simple question, but why is it when you give women an equal, a prominent role in this lasts much longer?
Well, there's a couple kind of flippant sayings, which I'm sure a number of the panelists here are well familiar with, as well as some of the audience members. I feel like one truism that we've had for quite a number of years is that I mean, just look at Afghanistan right now, I mean, Sudan being another example, but the most reliable way to get a seat at a peace table has been to pick up guns and commit atrocious violence. Also, another shorthand phrase that I feel like some of us are quite familiar with is that many peace processes are exercises of bad men negotiating with other bad men over power. And so I think what the Women, Peace and Security community has been advocating for, and also fortunately building up a very robust foundation of evidence around for quite a number of years, is this statistic that you referenced. And that's that women, a lot of times, due to our positionality within patriarchal societies, and I'm saying patriarchal societies everywhere on earth, there is not a set of countries where we have them and a set of countries where we don't. But our positionality within our patriarchal societies is often such that women exist as second-class citizens, and that second-class citizenry, of course, is influenced also by intersectional identities, second, third, fourth, fifth, and we keep going down from there. But that has oftentimes given women an empathetic perspective, not only on how oppression exists within societies for women, but sometimes also then how oppression exists and the removal or withholding of rights exists for other populations as well. So we have examples from Guatemala, from Luz Mendez, working with Indigenous women, to Northern Ireland and the work of Monica Williams and the Women's Political Party there, that show us that a lot of times the rights of other people that formed the underlying causes that were fomenting conflict were only brought to the table when we had women actively participating in those peace negotiations. And so you see, obviously, that then a peace agreement is more robust. It becomes less of a power sharing agreement and more, as Sanam Anderlini says, a responsibility sharing agreement, when you can bring together the needs and concerns of a greater diversity of the population. So that, as we look forward, I would say the caveat that I don't think that's the same as you don't just need a womb in the room. That's not enough. Putting any woman there is not sufficient. It has to be a woman that has that positional power and brings together a coalition or a network of concerns. And some of the most effective examples we've seen have been those women who participated in peace agreements and brought with them diverse networks of women that have crossed the conflict divides and been able to represent, as we've seen in examples in Sudan and elsewhere, and really brought together those needs for what will it take to create a future that benefits everybody. What does sustainable peace look like?
Thank you. That was super eloquent, Jen. And Ellen, I want to go and get your sense of that intersectional, that gendered lens. How is that playing out in the work that you're doing around peace and security, and perhaps maybe in the context of engaging women in civic life?
Thank you. And everyone's been just being so eloquent. It's so amazing. And I feel empowered by everyone else's, and to really acknowledge, Nazik, your incredible work in a very dangerous situation, and just keeping on and sharing with us and letting us know, I hope later, how we can support you. For me, we're talking about systemic issues. And I have to acknowledge Kimberly Crenshaw, the Black scholar and activist leader, who came up with saying, sort of like Maya Angelou said, when even the rainbow is not enough. So when we use the intersectional lens, and as Charlotte said, we must have disaggregated data. But what I've said, and I've done so much work around urban issues. Before I was working more internationally. Now I'm doing that, but I'm also seeing cities is where the majority of people live. So if you put a gendered intersectional lens on, say, a city or a social movement, it means looking at the policies, the programs, the budgets, the funding, the staffing, and the governance. So all of those systemic areas, you have to have that intersectional lens. Are Black women there in the leadership? Is the policy addressing Black women's needs? Are Indigenous peoples' lands, unceded, stolen lands, and their fight for the right to control whether pipelines go across their lands being heard in your climate change movement? When we're addressing militarism, do we realize that it's the military that's being used to stop those Indigenous fights and often arresting women, and what's happening to those children? So we have to really, whether we're looking at governments or we're looking at our own movements, we have to use that intersectional gendered lens. And the only way we substantially see it is to use disaggregated data. And that came up at UN Habitat in the Women's Assembly that happens at every World Urban Forum meeting, Habitat meeting. The unanimous agreement of people is they needed the intersectional lens, but without the disaggregated data, they couldn't prove to people why we need 50% of the peacekeepers at the table must be Indigenous and local women who represent their movements, because they know what is happening to the children, they know what's happening to the sick, they know what's happening to the elderly, they know whether there's tents needed, they know whether there's food needed, and they know in Afghanistan who's getting out and who's not getting out, and why aren't they getting out. So I think that's, to me, really, really fundamental. And part of it is also to reach out to other social movements, as I think we're seeing so clearly in Canada after the last few weeks, is the need to broaden our movement so that we're working. When we use the intersectional lens, we can go to the climate change movement and say, you are not looking at an Indigenous leadership in this situation, or where is the Black leadership in what you're doing? And so what we did in Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Canada, we did a joint letter saying buying fighter jets is not feminist action. Spending $88 billion when with the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, 312 recommendations have not yet been addressed. And we still don't have a national child care strategy on the ground. So and when we look at some of the things that Tamara Lawrence, who works with us, went to COP26 and brought back, took our banners with her and talked about, our National Week of Action, fighter jets are climate threats. So that's a way of seeing the intersectionality of other social movements with our women's movements. And I think that's the other way that you can address some of these critical issues. And it's also, I think, for a lot of people, I think back to the campaign, Women Mobilizing for Climate Change, Justice, Gender Equality, and Feminist Peace. It's a way of not siloing our movements when we have so little time with because of militarism and because of the climate change disaster that is coming out of militarism, that we can broaden and deepen everybody's movement to include all people, but with the leadership, with those who are most impacted. Sorry, I could go on and on, but each one of us could, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And what was really interesting for me is, even though none of you have met each other prior to this conversation, the how that you were literally piling on to each other's ideas, and you can see that there is this thread of how critical the nature is of dealing with a gendered and intersectional lens. And you were so right that Ms. Crenshaw, that gift that she gave us with that language and how we have adapted and used it is so critical to how conversations happen now. We have behind the scenes decided that we're not going to take a break because this conversation is so engaging. So if anybody watching this conversation needs to take a quick break, please go ahead and do that. We're just going to stay on because there's so much richness happening. And we want to take a second now to actually go to our audience and get some perspective from them. So we're going to ask you a question. And I know that one of our tech people is going to put this question up on the site so we can all see it, and then everybody can jump in and respond to it. And so that the question is that, as a global citizen, recognizing that we're all global citizens, how can each of us, how can we lift up and empower women to be leaders in our own communities? What do we need to do so that we can empower women in our own communities to be leaders?
Do you want us to answer, or what?
If you can give us a sentence or two as other people watching this conversation jump in, that would be great, Ellen.
I'm just going to quickly throw out something that we did for the last federal election. Is we did a report card for the election, asking women and asking parties what were the key issues for them. And we pointed out that if we used 1/3 of the federal budget, that is 1/3 of every department's budget is spent on defense spending, we could actually cover those needs. So it's a way of listening to people and finding what their priorities were, but also showing them that Canada could be a peacekeeping nation. Canada could once again emerge as a peacekeeping nation if we took that 1/3 of the federal budget for defense and put it into social needs, both internationally and addressing, say, the TRC or the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls recommendations. It was very simple, very easy.
Thank you. So that's one of those other things that maybe you will just add that into the chat, that rethinking our budget processes that to focus on peace and security would make a difference. And clearly some people have added that making sure that women have a seat at the table, and any place that we sit on a committee or an organization where we can raise our hand and say, how are the Indigenous women represented in this conversation, or how are the women who are living with disabilities recognized in this conversation is a piece of that puzzle. And then encouraging meaningful participation. So the importance that it's not just about sitting there, it's about creating ways for people to have a voice that can be heard. And this comment about eliminating barriers, something as simple as is the meeting being held in a room where someone who's in a wheelchair can get to that room? Do people have enough access to the technology or fluency with the technology, or can someone support them so they can jump onto a Zoom call? All different kinds of barriers, and creating support around people who are needing to have difficult conversations. I know that the conversations that we're hearing from Nazik come because she has a people holding her up, women holding her up, to be able to share some of the information about how difficult the situation is right now in the Sudan. Sharing the message that all women, don't let self-doubt stop you. That is such an important piece of the puzzle. Helping people find that piece of courage, holding their hand, speaking to them, giving them the confidence to say what it is that they want to say. All important pieces of how we can hold up women. And I will go back to that comment I made earlier, that we are all leaders. Every conversation that we have and the language that we choose to use is all part of how we hold up women in our communities. Absolutely, creating places where women can learn, the work that Ellen and her colleagues are doing to help young women get engaged in civic life and have the courage and the confidence and the support to put their hand up and say, sure, I'll run for office, or I'll chair a committee, or I'll take on that leadership role. And absolutely the financial support. And this speaks to the work that's being done at the national level around making sure childcare is available so that women can be engaged. And so that there's enough resources in each family so that women can take a role in the conversations that are happening in their communities and more broadly, so that they can reach out and attend meetings and be part of organizations. These are all absolutely important pieces of the puzzle. Thank you so much, all of you, for engaging in that conversation. And I think as other ideas come up, don't hesitate to post them. And just a reminder to you to be thinking about that woman that you see as a leader. What are the characteristics that you know about that individual? We're going to ask you to come back to that question just as we end our conversation. And I'm going to ask our tech team to take us back, and I want to get back to our table and ask a couple of more questions of the guests at our table. You tech people are so amazing. Thank you so much for this. I am just in awe of what they're making happen. This is an incredibly complex conversation and with a lot of layers happening, and these folks are amazing. I want to ask the question about longevity of conflict. The one that talks about much of the conflict that we see today has existed in some way, shape, or form for a really long time. And I have a two-part question that I want to ask you. The first is, how have you seen women that you work with innovate or do something differently to advance peace and security? And what can we learn from how their innovation or their nuanced shift in things? What can we learn from what happened as a result of that? Ellen, are you open to
Sure.
Can you jump into that question? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, there are so many fantastic examples, whether it was in 1915 that Women's International League for Peace and Freedom really lobbied European parliamentarians, and the League of Nations was set up, and then out of that came the UN. And this is a small group of women in really early days who did that, and then went on to fight for Resolution 1325. But I can think of the Code Pink, Medea Benjamin. Like I know a lot of the women's marches in the States since then. A lot of people have worn pink, and it's just a symbol of taking back something that used to be something that made us feel weaker. Although we loved the color, we rejected it, and now we've taken it back again. If I think of women in black in Israel and Palestine working across the terrible tearing apart of those lands and those peoples. The Walk for Justice sisters in Vancouver, two Indigenous women, one without a leg, walked from Vancouver to Ottawa, Vancouver to Prince George, and raising the issue of the murdered and missing women, and finally got the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls campaign going. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has a framework for working on the SDG goals from a feminist peace perspective, and it's up on our website. So that's another example. Satsuko Thurlow, Hiroshima survivor, who now is speaking all over the world for peace, speaking at the UN and other places. She came here as she was young. I think she was 15 when she was in Hiroshima when it was bombed, and now spends her life speaking on peace issues. Ray Atchison, who wrote the book Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. So there's lots of things we can do, having little tea parties in our homes, doing flash mobs. In Vancouver, we do flash mobs dressed in pink. And so there's the very serious, deep research that lets us know how much fighter jets cost and how much childcare that would be provided. And then there's the speaking in webinars, but there's also those very simple little like neighborhood cafes that make such a difference to empowering women, or in Iraq, women having other women to their homes to have a cup of tea and talking of the issue. So we have to find the ways of fighting back that work for us and use the technology that's now available to share those ideas with each other. And now I think, Canada has a possibility of funding more of these initiatives, and we have to figure out how to get that money to those women.
Jen, do you want to jump in and maybe share with us some experience you've had about women innovating in terms of how to deal with longstanding conflict and what you saw them learn from those innovations?
Sure. I mean, I've seen this across a couple different areas of my work, but I was going to talk about Peace Geeks a little bit, and the fact that Peace Geeks has an office in Vancouver, and we also have an office in Amman, Jordan, and it's led by an incredible group of colleagues there, and a woman leader herself, Dana Saleh. And the work that they're doing there is centered on technology and actually builds on some of the things that Charlotte was saying earlier. But it's a space that I have to admit, my background in gender or sexual and gender-based violence and peace building hadn't touched on much. If anything, I'd say that I was a tech critic and pretty tech naive for much of my career. And I've really had to come to understand the ways in which centering digital space, much as feminists from around the world have centered space in really provocative ways, like what the first founders of WILPF did 100 years ago, really causes us to rethink what security and insecurity looks like in different spaces. And so with our youth and right now, thinking about Jordan from an external perspective, and I think in geopolitics, a lot of people look at Jordan as a bastion of stability within a pretty volatile region. But thinking again from a feminist or human security lens at the ways in which discrimination, violence against women can both influence the everyday lived realities of women and girls, men and boys in the country, and then extrapolating from that, as is true everywhere, to how those can also manifest and influence those kind of invisible forms of violence, manifest and influence the more overt types of recruitment to extremist groups in the region that again, much of our geopolitical and militarized lens would focus on as insecurity. So my colleagues in Jordan and the ways that they have been innovating and quite frankly teaching me to rethink digital space through a lens of asking women and girls, men and boys, what the harmful and divisive narratives that they experience in everyday life look and feel like, the ways in which, especially from a gendered perspective, those narratives influence them and their security. And then imagine what kind of future would they want to have. They then work through digital content spaces, both online, and they also bring it offline to huge murals, but primarily focusing on digital spaces, blogs, videos, podcasts, things like that. They create these, what they call transformative narratives of, again, promoting a kind of society that they would want to see. And then they promote that in digital spaces. And it has been, for me, a very innovative and new way, and a lot of our partners too, to look at issues of again, human security, of division, of harmful narratives that are influencing, very diverse populations. We're working in East Amman and Husaifa and Zarqa, communities that have a lot of second or third generation refugees from countries in the region, as well as very diverse Jordanian citizens that are there, and the kind of vision that they're promoting, and then engaging them in spaces is teaching us things around, how credible we're all engaged in social change if we're looking at working towards societies that are more peaceful and more gender equitable. So how are social change messages received in digital spaces? How does the messenger influence how those messages are received? Is it enough to, one of the questions that we were curious about originally was, is content produced by men better received by men and boys than content that's produced by women? So we were exploring those, and unsurprisingly, perhaps to us, we were finding that it's not enough to purely look at across a gender lens. We also have to look at issues of credibility. Who is that message coming from? For certain age demographics, the community origin, the language and the dialects that were being used in exclusively Arabic language content that was being produced influenced how those social change messages were being received. The provocativeness, the extent to which that content touched on taboos was received differently by different age demographics. The youth were more open to more provocative, more taboo subjects. They were also more influenced by influencers posting content versus content creators that were seen to be hyper local to their community. Those were also considered to be some of the most credible messengers. So just a snapshot of again, I've engaged much more in kind of the in-person dialogues around, the absolutely vital human to human interactions around support, addressing conflict and working toward building more peaceful societies that are more equitable for everyone. But I'm learning through my colleagues the ways in which innovations in not just content, but kind of how we see inclusion in that content, how we see voice and credibility in that content that's being produced can create some really powerful outcomes. I mean, millions of viewers and engagement in some of this content. So an inspiration for me, at least, to kind of rethink how that can play out in other areas of our advocacy and work domestically in Canada, in other countries, in our international solidarity movements, etc.
Absolutely, Jen. I was listening to a CBC interview the other day, and they were interviewing a nun who had worked with Thich Nhat Hanh, and she was talking about, and she came from Afro-American heritage, and she talked about the odd time that someone from that same heritage would show up at one of the places that she was working, and her desire to just go and say, "You're like me," and that sense of where you can be connected with another person through whether it's your ability, or whether it's your language, or whether it's the color of your skin, or whether it's the language you speak, that opens up a communication. And you've been so eloquent in saying that. Nazik, in the Sudan and the work that you're doing there, what kind of innovation are you seeing? What's happening that's different, and how is that playing out? And recognizing that we learn as much from our mistakes as we do from our successes. So what's working? Where are the challenges? What's innovative there?
Well, I think there is two layers of the innovation that I would love to highlight. The first layer is kind of very disorganized. Maybe it wasn't even intended, but I think that I believe that women we are the carrier of life, and of course we are the protector of our heritages in all over the world. And I think this ability to create life is something that's sometimes really work beyond even our organizing, thinking, planning. you know, and it comes from women from the grassroots, you know, who haven't been educated, who did not thought enough about things. The experience that I would like to highlight is in Sudan, actually, most of the displaced people because of the conflicts for sure were women. 55% of more than 3 million internally displaced people in our country are women. And those women had to come to the capital of Sudan, Khartoum, and had to reinvent their lives again. Within a very restricted Islamic regime that prevented many of them from wearing what they want, working where they can, you know, lots of restrictions. So one of the practices that those internally displaced women who have no education, and no connections in this big city, they started to sell tea on the streets. And they completely changed the public scheme in the whole city. They revived it. They made this little spot under the trees where people can sit down and just drink tea and have conversations. And these women who are actually in so many times, they are also mothers of young men, young women. They started to mothering all of these people who were, you know, coming to drink tea with them. And they told their stories, and they created some sort of, you know, connection with those people who living in the city, who have never seen these conflict areas, and made it easy for them to understand the whole country's struggle, especially for the younger generation. And those women were very strong. They have been fighting every day against the police attacks against them, to take them out of the streets. And, you know, we had a very vicious law that's called public order law, which was restricting women work and their existence on the streets and all of that throughout the last 30 years. So those women fighting for their living and spreading love, spreading wisdom, and telling their own stories have managed, in my opinion, this is something that I haven't written yet, but I'm planning to. I think those women were very powerful in bringing some sort of the demand of peace to be the headline of our revolution. And I think that is something that's very powerful. They did not plan for it, you know, but because their struggle was real, their love was real, their wisdom was real, they were able to actually unify a whole country, in my opinion. One of the leaders of these women, they have a small union, a few years ago, have won the Award of Courage presented by the Foreign Ministry in the United States. And I think she deserved it, because those women were very courageous, as I said, in fighting against all of these government attacks against their surviving work. Their existence also in the revolution. For example, they were playing an important role in providing security, because people, when during all of the crackdown on protest, we have protest every Thursday at 1 p.m. exactly. And that protest, for people to come into the to the point of protest, they have to hide. So they were just sitting in with these women who are selling tea on the streets and having these normal conversations. And those women were acting as kind of protectors. They warned them, police is coming from this way, you don't have to sit here, you know. And the other rule as well, that our protest was starting with a women chant, which is Zagruta, which is women. It was being used for celebration in the African Arabian culture, where women have this loud voice of chanting. And that was the point where all of the people come together and start the protest. And that was also one of the key innovative, points for Sudanese women in actually going back to all of the intersectionality and the gender rules that's also being re-innovated through our struggles. We in Sudan, we are trying, for example, through this Zagruta, women have redefined this practice, which was a tool for expressing joy, or sometimes also sadness when someone is died. It's became the voice of the revolution. So sometimes, even the tools of the social norms that have been used to oppress women can be re-innovated and create something that's could really be amazing. And that is why I started by saying that Sudanese, women in general are holders of heritage, and that's why they are also can create new heritages. And I believe that Sudanese women through this revolution have started just that in our context.
Thank you. And I know I'm not the only one who wants to know what that single word is that we all should know to hold up the Sudanese women. So can you spell that word, and one of our tech people will get it up so we can all see it?
So it's Zagruta, which is a chant. I have mentioned it in one of my articles. I will try to share it in the chat later on as well. Because it was the point of encouragement, as I said, for people and to start the protest.
Thank you so much. We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to open this up because I know the audience is chomping at the bit to ask some questions as well. But I want to get at this values question. And Charlotte, I'm going to ask the question of you first. In your experience in Central America, and then of course for our other guests in the Sudan and in Canada, what are the values of international solidarity and cooperation? And how do you leverage those values in your international and your community-based work to advance the work of these organizations?
Great, thank you. I think I would start out thinking about sort of where you're trying to go. For me, sort of values are driven by, I don't know if looking for structural and institutional changes in a value, but it's trying to think about where are you trying to go. I think also, again, the history educator in me wants to look at also what is the history of this development, solidarity, cooperation work. And so how do, as practitioners, as activists, as leaders, work to try to disrupt some of the dynamics of power that I would argue perhaps has plagued this field, and to look at what does structural institutional change look like, with combining that with sustainable collaborative interventions, projects that are driven by local partners. So for me, that there's value in, as I say, sort of disrupting those north-south hierarchies that are particularly prevalent. And that means thinking about, and I really appreciate what Nazik was talking about, sort of looking at where wisdom comes from. What are the systems of knowledges that are at play in the projects we're doing? Whose expertise are we valuing? And so it's looking for wisdom and different ways of knowing. And so who does that come from, and whose voices get put into, and this goes where it comes from, the building of a proposal for a project, whose voices are in there? People talk about consultation and there's participatory appraisal, right? But what does that really look like where the folks with local knowledge who knows what are going on with experience, they might not have there's a particular rhetoric around sort of development speak, right? How do you do a log frame? What does a story of success look like? And so how do in solidarity, we help different folks have access to that language such that their voices, ways of knowledge, and ways of analyzing the world and what the problem is can help come up with better solutions, right? That are truly sustainable. And so for me, it's that collaboration, which can be an empty word, but what does true solidarity collaboration look like in a development context? And then also as practitioners, as organizations, how do we do the work as well ourselves? But at that international representation, I apologize, I don't remember who was talking about it. Maybe it was Ellen. It was who's on your board, who's on the leadership of your organization, finances, budgets. How are we interrupting those internal inequalities and then putting that into our work? So it's that internal work as institutions that are coupled with how we engage with partners and colleagues and collaborators. So I think there's also something really tricky is trying to help also institutions and our favorite donors who also, they have responsibility to taxpayers, right? As well, what does flexibility look like? And how do we continue to learn and adapt? And how do we do long-term in the justice sector? This is long-term work. It's not a 2-year and we do a training and we're out, right? Like, what does that long-term work look like within the current funding systems? And so this is the struggle where the work and the collaboration, the relationships, I feel like the project we just ended, I feel like we're just getting started now. We were just sort of getting our, really getting going. And that's sort of the trouble of how do you fit into these values into a system that still has a lot of legacies of the past, right? And so I think for me, that's a bit of the struggle, right? And sort of trying to figure out, that's where inclusion is a bit tricky, right? We're giving people language to apply to projects, right? And helping our partners do that, but it's not really changing the structure. So it's very tricky. And I think I'll leave it there. I think that gives enough fodder for debate.
Absolutely. And the word that keeps ringing through my mind as you were speaking is this piece around interruption and the collective responsibility of people around this table and the people listening to do more interrupting and having the filters for that information adjusted. I mean, I work with the Maasai in Tanzania, and I am so aware of how much of what I hear from them is filtered through my colonial, white settler, academic frameworks. And part of my job is to talk less and listen more and try to get myself somehow in the seat of the people that are teaching me. I'm seeing
if I may just echo, I think that goes to the question asked to the audience, to lift up, empower others, perhaps we need to change the verbs. Like, what does it mean to step back and listen and let folks, right? Like, I as a white, well, I'm from the United States, not Canadian, right? Like, I don't think it is my role to empower anybody else, right? I need to get out of the way, right? And what does it mean to amplify and make space and that may mean for me to be quiet, which is what I'm going to do right now.
And Nazik, I was seeing you nodding and nodding and nodding. So please jump in. What are the values and how do we leverage them to advance work?
I was just as I have just said, it's not always the organized things that's always really make the deepest changes. As I have just mentioned, the example of those women who are just tea sellers, maybe they don't see themselves doing any actual role, they're just, going by, doing their own lives, but they have made a significant change. Maybe I do very much agree with what Charlotte was saying, that we need to listen more. And I think that with the social media right now, and actually the new generation is active, on birth, everyone have her own opinion, and they are very able to share it, even in our, very poor, suppressed countries, social media have provided these spaces for self-expression and participation. And that has played a great role, in my opinion, even in the revolution in Sudan and in the process of change, in networking, in creating advocacy networks and so on. So what we are looking for, actually, it's not just getting people more engaged, it's getting those who make the decisions able to listen to what people are saying, you know, and that actually for me is meaning for us who are talking, whoever we are. We need to be more firm in our demands. We need to take it as a responsibility, because I see lots of collapsing of the old forms of organizations, for example, political parties. For example, in Sudan right now, our revolution, the younger generation is kind of refusing to cooperate with any political party. They are creating a grassroots political movements led by neighborhoods committees. They are looking into building a movement from down up. From the scratch, you know, and I think this is not just happening in Sudan. This is, I think, happening globally. And in terms of looking into this, you know, reconstruction of the whole political movement, processes of decision making, we have to be, you know, aware that we have new challenges. We are living virtually in so many, you know, terms, you know, if you think about it. And so we need to be more careful in making sure that, you know, what we are doing is really efficient and effective. And we need to be more consistent in doing what we are doing as individuals. For example, when everyone asks me, I participate in events like this here in Canada and in other countries, and you know, people ask me about this, you know, how we can support, you know, the advocacy. I say it starts from your personal decision to who you are going to vote for your city or council or state representative. You know, if you don't bring another Trump, you have done a good thing to our world. You know, we in Sudan, in the smallest village there, we thank you. So we basically need to be, you know, personally very conscious about our actions and decisions in general. In terms of empowerment of women, for those tea sellers, for example, the empowerment they need, it doesn't have to be education. It doesn't have to be the very vague world development, you know. It has to be respect for their ways of lives and innovation that they have already created, and just let them be. And that's what they were fighting for. And I saw so many of these women who have educated families, and they have, you know, helped sons and other families and build houses, and you know, they rebuild their own lives. So they don't really need our help. They really need us to give them the space to be. That's it.
Absolutely, get out of their way so that they can live their lives. Absolutely. Jen, your comments on the values that are embedded in international solidarity and how to leverage them. And of course, please feel free to reflect on what you've heard Charlotte and Nazik say if that question isn't resonating with you.
Oh, it is absolutely resonating. I feel like I'm never going to be a poker player, but listening to both Nazik and Charlotte there and gesticulating and everything, like they've said it so well. I was gonna, if Charlotte hadn't, I was gonna reflect back on the word empowerment, not as a critique, it's very ubiquitous, but I don't have an issue with the word, I have an issue with how we use it. And that's that it's still used so often as a doing to somebody else, you empower somebody else. And to me, that just sets up a really paternalistic power dynamic, and thinking about, instead of empowerment, thinking about how do we create the enabling conditions for people to empower themselves? We all have power within us. The women who are selling tea in Sudan have so much flipping power that they have, like that is the movement. Those are the energy and the expertise and the dynamics that end up transforming violent conflict a lot of the time. Wide space movements by people who are on the ground and stand up and say, okay, this is enough. And so rather than this kind of, education or the other things that we've talked about, how can we work more to look at the systems and the institutions, as has been mentioned by both Nizik and Charlotte, and think about what would those enabling conditions look like and what is each of our roles to do that. And I feel like for me personally, that has to happen in conversation as an ongoing questioning and reflection on positionality for that dynamic and that movement. Is it getting the hell out of the way? Is it staying quiet? Is it advocating to donors that they need to reframe the grant processes and funding structures? I worked with women peacemakers for a number of years, building what we called a peace building global compact around what we thought the major pain points were on building more mutually beneficial funding relationships and safety and security partnerships and more power balanced relationships. And so we had 4 pillars that we were working together with funders to say, this isn't serving anybody. This isn't building more peaceful societies. This is not achieving the aims that you ostensibly are setting out to achieve when you're releasing these funding calls or when you are investing in international development. So if you can recognize that our processes are so antiquated and still have so many legacies of colonial and kind of patriarchal power dynamics built into them, that they are not achieving the aims that the taxpayers are ostensibly supporting this machinery to transform, then the only way we can be effective is if we come together through, better partnerships, better rethinking what expertise looks like, rethinking how to change those structures so that they are beneficial to the aims that we all seek to create together, and then being courageous enough to work on the dismantling of those structures and rebuilding them in a more equitable way, because incremental changes can do a lot. But I think for some of these structures, incremental changes aren't enough. And we really need to think much more innovatively around dismantling and kind of restructuring them in very fundamental ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. I am reminded as you were speaking, Jen, of the whole direct and control language that's embedded into our Canadian Revenue Agency dialogue around how we as Canadians and immigrants and permanent residents make contributions for global engagement. And then supposedly the direction and the control is coming from somewhere in Canada, as opposed to where, in my humble opinion, it belongs, which is in Makiuni in Tanzania, or in a community in the Sudan, or in San Marcos around Lago de Atitlan. That's where the direct and control needs to be.
Absolutely. And just to add one more sentence to that, direct and control and kind of an audit mentality around risk, the risk of funding peace building work in Sudan. Working to totally flip that perception around what kind of risk are we thinking about? Are we thinking about the risk to have a monetary sum that is not sufficiently supported with receipts, to give a very granular example? And that's our perception of risk, because we're so, concerned about, corruption in one language, patronage and clientelism in another. Or if we recognize the context in which we are working, what does risk look like for Sudanese women in that context? Like, they are trying to just, erupt an entire fucking government. I mean, let's think about who is actually taking the risk to do this work and reframe it accordingly.
Absolutely. Nizik, please, you wanted to jump in.
I just like what you have said, Jen, regarding, how, I just wanted to flip the coin, and also it's also related to what Charlotte was saying earlier. It's not always about giving. It's sometimes about understanding how the local systems in different countries are really working. And I think that lots of the problems of the processes of interventions, either by international donors, either countries or NGOs, is not, paying enough time to understand the local context. And to understand these local contexts, for sure, you need to have people from these contexts who are inside your processes, not it doesn't have to be inside the decision-making process, but at least in the advisory level, where you have people you can advise by and actually take these advices seriously. But actually, the other point that I wanted to say is actually, I have made a small contribution to the the process of making of the Canada feminist global agendas. And I one of the points that I have written is that, for example, for Sudan, I think Canada does not need to give us money, but when it's planning for its international engagement, it's need to understand its own friendships, coalitions, how these coalitions are affecting countries like Sudan. For example, right now, how Canada is investing its own money, not just in Sudan, but in the other countries. Are these countries are supportive of democracy, of human rights? For example, we can see how countries like the Gulf countries are, creating a whole movement of counter-revolution in Sudan and supporting our military right now against the pro-democracy movement. So how Canada as a country is looking into its own relations with countries in the Gulf, and dealing with them in planning for so-called the feminist, foreign affairs policy, and how Canada, for example, is looking into the investments in fields like, the, gold mining, in countries where there is situations of conflicts, is the country is really looking into how these kind of international trade engagements affecting the situation on the ground for women, peace and security. For example, right now in Sudan, and part of our own problem as a country is that we have a militia. It's just a militia, not a military, that is stepping up to lead the whole country because it's able to smuggle gold to United Arab Emirates. And they have all of the money of the country in their pockets. We are looking to international aid where we don't need it. This militia have just smuggled more than $6 billion of gold in the last 3-4 years. And we are begging for 3 million from the World Bank, So, this is kind of the, intersectional, issues that we really need to be serious in looking at them, and be very conscious in the process of decision making when we look at them. So it's basically not what you give, it's what's your decisions are, how you make your relations. These countries need to be cautious about all of this.
Absolutely. How we make our relations. What a wonderful phrase for us to be thinking about, and to think about the values that underpin who we build relationships and how we manage and maintain those relationships. Ellen, we haven't had a chance to hear from you in terms of your perspective around what are the values around solidarity and cooperation, and how do we leverage those in our work. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Thank you.
I think that the global funding has to use that intersectional lens. It has to provide long-term funding, not short-term funding. The funding really has to go to women, has to go to the LGBTQ communities, the Indigenous, Black, Asian people who are on the ground and know how to organize. They're already organizing their own communities. They need the funding to build the structures and to be able to have the money to mentor people who really in their guts know how to organize, but need to share those strategies across around. Because I think we're all aware we have to build coalitions, and there's something so much bigger. You know, you talk about the gold being smuggled to the really big guys. You know, we're dealing with the military industrial complex that's very, very powerful. So we have to get the money to the people on the ground who can mentor and build those coalitions necessary to address it, and not think that these are separate things. We shouldn't feel guilty about we're not using plastic bags. We need to be looking at who's really creating the pollution. And again, you go back to the military industrial complex. If 1/3 of the Canadian government goes to the military industrial complex, and what is it, 800 billion of the US budget goes to the military. I don't remember exactly what it was. You know, these are not little problems, but we, you know, in that hierarchy, we have a huge base of people who are already having those selling those cups of tea and listening and know what's happening on the ground. We need to be funding them in a sustainable way that enables them to do what needs to be done. I'm going to keep it short because I know there's amazing people who would like to contribute or ask questions.
We are 1 minute away from needing to kind of pull this all together. And so I think I still have pages of questions that I asked. I know that we're all going to be looking for ways that we can continue this conversation as we move forward. But we also have an audience that, and all of us have schedules after the 3 o'clock bell rings. So what I'm going to do is ask Beatrice, who is managing our Mentimeter, to post for everybody to see that question that I asked, that we all reflect on around a woman that we know who may be famous and may not be famous. What are the values, or what are the qualities that woman demonstrates? What do we admire? And I'm going to ask everybody who's participating in this to add the words that speak to what are the qualities that you admire in that person. So please feel free to throw them up there. Thank you so much, everybody, for helping us create this very powerful statement about what we've heard and learned today. Compassion right in the center of all of this. The importance of resilience. Thoughtfulness. Yes, and we certainly have seen humility played out this afternoon, haven't we? Self-knowledge, such an important piece of this conversation. Just give you a minute or two if there's anything else that you think you want to add to help us fill out this word cloud. Thank you, everybody, for sharing all your thoughts and your thinking with us to create this. I'm fascinated that right in the center is courage, resilience, and compassion, all things that happen in your heart first. So now I'm going to ask us that we can all gather back together again. And this is my opportunity to say, as my colleagues in Tanzania would say, Ashe Nalang to you, Jen, and because Nazik and Charlotte and Elaine for sharing so eloquently and so fluently from your experience, from your passion, and to helping us get just a little bit of an insight into the work that you are doing and that we can all do to be leaders around building more peace and security right in our own communities, in Ottawa and Toronto and all the other big cities that are struggling right now with that. The reminders that we have an opportunity to do that in the coming weeks as the annual walk to support the work around murdered and missing women in this country. And we know that that exists in many countries around the world. So we walk here, but it exists everywhere. So thanks to each of you for being here and for being so generous in your conversations. And then Kat, over to you.
Unmute myself. In 30 seconds, I could say the 15 names and the organizations that have supported this and how happy I am to have met you. And really, it starts with Eve, Angelo, Beatrice, Christina, Brianne, Mary, Laurel, Holly. The work that you've done in the background, we cannot thank you enough. It's not the background, it's the setting up of this incredible event. It's been an honor to find how you found the panelists and my dear friends panelists, Ellen, Nazik, Jen, Charlotte. Your interventions have been just wonderful. Colleen, bringing everything together. Colleen is a longtime member of, community activism in the region of Comox, but also international activism and through BCCIC. That was fabulous. Anita Vandenbelt, I speak with you in the informal tense that we would use in French, in that if you're still there, it was wonderful to have you introduce this event in particular. So thank you very much. Of course, this is all done also in partnership with Global Affairs Canada. And again, even as I thank everybody, I'd like to remind us that this discussion continues. The conversations continue. The need to look at the multiple struggles that women have when they tackle peace, whether it's negative or positive peace. Women will have 5 or 6 or 7 layers of oppression or obstacles to face, whether it's being a Guarani woman who is rejected by her community for being a leader, who has to look out for her economic sustenance while at the same time leading and being threatened. We thank all those women who continue to give the example, and all those hundreds of thousands of women who probably burn out before they get to be famous. I'm not even chuckling. I know some of those women who just said, I can't do it anymore, and they'll take a breath for a few hours, a few years in some case, and then continue. So thank you all so very much. Thank you to Amnesty International, to WILP, Peace Geeks, Justice Education Society, UBC Oris, UBC Global Lounge, and of course, my colleagues at BCCIC and GAC. Colleen, I think it's, I'm not sure if I'm the final words, but I really want to thank you again.
Better actually hit the mute button. And yes, my pleasure as well. And I would just like to end on the comment that women carry a lot of challenges, but they also have huge strength. And we have strength in numbers. So let's join hands across the many miles, across all this digital space, and make things happen together. Bless you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.